wooden platform creaked under Margaret's weight as rough hands shoved her forward. Her bad leg, the left one that never quite healed right after the wagon accident, buckled slightly, and she grabbed the auction post to steady herself. A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd of cowboys gathered in the dusty town square of Redemption Falls, Texas. "Look at that!" someone shouted. "She can't even stand straight." Margaret's cheeks burned red as fire. Her worn brown dress, patched at the elbows and hem, hung loose on her thin frame. At 28 years old, she felt ancient compared to the other young women lined up behind her pretty girls with smooth skin and bright smiles who would surely find husbands today. The auctioneer, a portly man named Buck Williams with a handlebar mustache, raised his gavel. "Now, gentlemen, we got ourselves a special case here. Margaret Colby, widow of the late Henry Colby. She's a hard worker, knows her way around a kitchen, and she walks like a three-legged mule." A cowboy in the front row hollered. More laughter exploded from the crowd. Margaret wanted to disappear. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole, but she stood there, frozen, because she had no choice. When her husband Henry died 6 months ago, he left her with nothing but debts. The bank had taken their small farm. She had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. This bride auction was her last chance at survival. "Starting bid is $50, Buck announced, his voice booming across the square. Silence, the kind of silence that makes your stomach twist into knots. Buck cleared his throat. "Come now, gentlemen, surely someone wants a capable woman who can cook and clean." "I wouldn't pay $5 for that cripple," someone yelled. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She would not cry, not here. Not in front of these cruel men who looked at her like she was a broken horse not worth the cost of feed. $40? Buck tried again, his voice losing confidence. Nothing. A tumbleweed rolled across the dusty street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, but not a single hand went up. Margaret's heart sank deeper and deeper, like a stone dropping into a bottomless well. She had known this might happen. She had prepared herself for rejection. But actually living through it standing on this platform while hundreds of men looked right through her, like she was invisible, hurt worse than any physical pain her bad leg had ever caused. $30? Buck's voice cracked. "That's practically giving her away, boys. Nobody wants damaged goods," a cowboy shouted, and his friends slapped their knees, laughing so hard their hats fell off. That's when Margaret saw them 3 young women behind her, whispering and giggling. One was Sarah Bell, the banker's daughter, with golden ringlets and a blue silk dress that probably cost more than Margaret had earned in her entire life. Sarah Bell leaned toward her friends and said, loud enough for Margaret to hear, "Poor thing, I almost feel sorry for her." Almost. The other girls erupted in giggles. Buck Williams wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Listen here, this is a Christian town. Someone needs to step up and $20, a voice called out. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound. A skinny cowboy with pockmarked cheeks and yellow teeth stood near the back, but the look in his eyes made Margaret's skin crawl. She had seen that look before on men who beat their horses and kicked their dogs. "We have $20 from Mr. Griggs," Buck said quickly, relief flooding his face. "Wait!" Griggs shouted. "I ain't finished. $20, but only if she agrees to work my ranch without pay for 5 years. She can sleep in the barn with the animals where she belongs." The crowd roared with laughter. Buck's face fell. "Mr. Griggs, that's not how this works. This is a marriage auction, not a, who else is gonna take her?" Griggs challenged. "I'm offering her a roof over her head. That's more than she deserves." Margaret felt sick. Her hands trembled as they gripped the auction post tighter. 5 years as a servant, no, a slave sleeping in a barn, probably beaten whenever she couldn't work fast enough because of her leg. That wasn't survival. That was a living death. But what choice did she have? Buck looked at Margaret with something close to pity. "Miss Colby, do you accept?" "No," Margaret whispered. "What was that?" Buck leaned closer. "No," Margaret said louder, her voice shaking but firm. "I'd rather starve than accept that offer." The crowd went quiet for a moment, then exploded in chaos. "She's refusing! Ungrateful woman! Who does she think she is?" Griggs's face turned purple with rage. "You stupid cripple! You think you're too good for me?" Buck raised his hands, trying to restore order. Now, let's all calm down. Miss Colby has the right to refuse. Are there any other offers? Anyone at all?" Margaret scanned the crowd desperately. Surely someone had a shred of kindness. Surely someone saw her as more than a broken thing. But every face looked back at her with either mockery, disgust, or complete indifference. "Going once," Buck's voice was resigned now. Margaret's chest tightened. What would happen to her if no one bid? Where would she go? She had no money, no food, nowhere to sleep tonight. Going twice. This was it. The end of everything. Margaret closed her eyes, unable to watch her final humiliation. Buck raised his gavel. "Going $1,000. The voice cut through the air like thunder. Margaret's eyes flew open. The entire crowd turned as one, gasping and murmuring. Standing at the very back of the square, partly hidden by shadow, was the tallest man Margaret had ever seen. He wore a black suit that looked expensive, really expensive, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even from a distance, Margaret could feel the power radiating from him. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the man walked forward, his boots shiny black leather, not the worn work boots every other cowboy wore, clicked against the wooden boards of the sidewalk. Every eye followed him, every mouth hung open. Buck Williams dropped his gavel. It clattered on the platform. Did you say $1,000? The man stopped at the base of the auction platform. He was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 35, with sharp features and eyes so dark they looked black. A thin scar ran along his jaw. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense. His face was too hard, too fierce, but there was something magnetic about him. "I said $1,000, the man repeated, his voice deep and smooth. "For Margaret Colby. And not as a servant, as my wife." The entire town of Redemption Falls seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Bell's mouth fell open. That's impossible. That's Jackson Kane," someone whispered in awe. The name rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Jackson Kane, the cattle baron, the richest man in the entire territory, owner of the massive Circle K ranch that sprawled across thousands of acres, a man so wealthy and powerful that governors asked for his advice. A man who never came to town, who stayed locked away on his ranch like a king in his castle. And he was here, looking directly at Margaret. "Mr. Kane," Buck stammered, "surely you don't mean that is to say there are other fine young women here who would—" "I want her." Jackson's eyes never left Margaret's face. "Do we have a deal or not?" Margaret couldn't breathe. This had to be a dream or a nightmare. Why would the richest man in Texas want her? It made no sense. None at all. Buck's hands shook as he picked up his gavel. If Miss Colby accepts, the bid is $1,000 from Mr. Jackson Kane." All eyes turned to Margaret. Her mind raced. Something was wrong here, very wrong. Men like Jackson Kane didn't bid on women like her. There had to be a catch, a trap, some cruel game she didn't understand. But what other option did she have? Refuse and starve in the streets? Accept Griggs's offer and become a slave? Jackson Kane took one step closer to the platform. For the first time, Margaret got a clear look at his eyes. They weren't cruel like Griggs's. They weren't mocking like the crowd's. They were calculating, like he was looking at a chess piece he needed for some strategy she couldn't see. "Miss Colby," he said quietly, and despite the chaos around them, his voice reached her perfectly. "I'm offering you a choice. Accept my offer, and you'll have wealth, status, and respect. Every person who laughed at you today will bow when you pass, or refuse, and face whatever comes next on your own." It wasn't a romantic proposal. It wasn't even kind. It was a business deal, plain and simple. But Margaret had learned long ago that life wasn't a fairy tale. Sometimes you just had to choose the option that let you survive another day. She lifted her chin, looking directly into Jackson Kane's dark eyes. "I accept." The crowd exploded into chaos. Cowboys shouting, women screaming. Sarah Bell actually faded, falling into her friend's arms. Buck slammed his gavel down over and over, trying to restore order. "Sold. Sold to Mr. Jackson Kane for $1,000. Jackson reached into his jacket and pulled out a roll of bills so thick it made Buck's eyes bulge. He counted out the money right there, crisp $100 bills that most people in Redemption Falls had never seen in their entire lives. Then Jackson did something that shocked everyone even more. He climbed onto the platform, not quickly, but with deliberate grace, and walked straight to Margaret. Before she could react, he shrugged off his expensive black jacket and draped it around her shoulders. The jacket was still warm from his body and smelled like leather and pine. "Come," he said simply, offering his arm. Margaret hesitated, then placed her hand on his arm. Even through his shirt sleeve, she could feel the hard muscle beneath. He was strong, very strong. As they descended the platform together, Jackson deliberately slowed his pace to match hers, accommodating her limp without drawing attention to it. That small gesture, so different from the mockery she'd endured, brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. The crowd pressed in around them, everyone shouting questions. "Mr. Kane, why her? What about your family? What will your mother say?" Jackson ignored them all. His face remained expressionless as stone as he guided Margaret through the crowd toward a gleaming black carriage waiting at the edge of the square. It was the fanciest carriage Margaret had ever seen, with gold trim and velvet curtains in the windows. A driver in a neat uniform jumped down and opened the door. "Wait!" someone shouted. Margaret turned to see an elderly woman pushing through the crowd. She wore an expensive purple dress and had silver hair piled high on her head. Her face was twisted with fury. "Jackson Kane, you stop right there," the woman demanded. Jackson's arm tensed under Margaret's hand, but he didn't stop moving. "I'm talking to you, boy," the woman shrieked. "How dare you? How dare you bring shame on this family?" "Hello, Mother," Jackson said flatly, not even looking at her. His mother. Margaret's stomach dropped. She should have known there would be family. Rich families like the Kanes had expectations, standards, and Margaret, a poor widow with a limp, definitely didn't meet them. Mrs. Kane's eyes locked on Margaret with pure hatred. "You will not marry this crippled beggar. I forbid it." Jackson finally turned to face his mother. When he smiled, it wasn't a happy smile. It was cold and sharp as a knife blade. "That's exactly why I'm doing it, Mother," he said quietly. "You and Father and every stuck-up member of this family have spent years trying to control me, trying to choose my wife, my life, my future. Well, I'm done. I'm marrying Margaret Colby, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." He turned back to Margaret. "Get in the carriage." Still reeling from this revelation, Margaret climbed awkwardly into the carriage, her bad leg making it difficult. Jackson followed smoothly and sat across from her. The driver shut the door. Through the window, Margaret could see Mrs. Kane screaming, her face red with rage. She could see Sarah Bell and her friends staring in disbelief. She could see Buck Williams counting his money with shaking hands. She could see the entire town of Redemption Falls watching as the richest man in the territory drove away with the woman everyone had rejected. The carriage lurched forward, and that's when the full weight of what just happened crashed down on Margaret. She wasn't saved. She was a pawn in some rich family's war. Jackson Kane didn't want her, he wanted revenge on his family. He'd bought her like a weapon to use against them. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you really do this?" Jackson leaned back against the velvet seat, his face unreadable. "Does it matter? You needed saving. I needed a wife who would infuriate my family. We both get what we want. But I didn't want this," Margaret said, anger starting to replace her shock. "I wanted someone who actually wanted me, not someone using me to hurt other people." For the first time, something flickered in Jackson's dark eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "Fair enough," he said. "Let me be clear then. My family is full of snobs who care only about money and status. They've been trying to marry me off to some rich girl for years. Someone proper, someone they can control. I'm sick of it." He leaned forward, his intense gaze locking onto Margaret. "When I saw you up there broken, rejected, humiliated, I saw an opportunity. Marry you and I achieve two things. First, I get revenge on my family by bringing home exactly the kind of wife they'll hate. Second, I save you from a terrible fate." That's horrible," Margaret breathed. "Is it?" Jackson challenged. "You were about to either starve or become Griggs's slave. Now you'll live in luxury. You'll have servants, fine clothes, good food, and respect whether people like it or not. They'll have to respect Mrs. Jackson Kane. Yes, I'm using you, but you're using me too. Fair trade." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to be angry, but he was right, and they both knew it. Still, one question burned in her mind. "What if your family tries to hurt me?" she asked quietly. "They clearly hate this, hate me. What if they—" Jackson's face hardened into something truly frightening. "Anyone who harms you answers to me. And trust me, Miss Colby, that's not something anyone wants to face." The threat in his voice was real, absolute. Margaret believed him completely. The carriage rolled on through the fading afternoon light, carrying Margaret away from her old life and towards something she couldn't begin to understand. She had escaped the auction block, escaped poverty and humiliation, but she'd walked straight into something else entirely, a battle between a powerful family and their rebellious son. And somehow she was now the prize in their war. Margaret looked out the window at the passing landscape. They were leaving Redemption Falls behind, heading toward the distant hills where the Kane Ranch supposedly sprawled across the horizon like a kingdom. Somewhere ahead lay her new life, a life of luxury built on revenge. A marriage to a man who saw her as a weapon, not a wife. Margaret touched the expensive jacket still wrapped around her shoulders and wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The carriage turned onto a private road, and through the trees, Margaret caught her first glimpse of the Kane mansion. It was enormous, 3 stories of white stone with columns like a Greek temple. Gardens surrounded it, and beyond that, she could see barns and stables that looked bigger than most houses. This would be her home now, her prison, or maybe, just maybe, her chance at something more. The carriage stopped in front of the mansion's grand entrance. Jackson stepped out first, then turned to help Margaret down. His hand was surprisingly gentle as it closed around hers. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," he said, and Margaret realized with a jolt that she was already his wife, at least in name. The auction had made it legal. She belonged to Jackson Kane now. The massive front doors opened, and servants poured out. A stern-looking woman in a black dress, clearly the head housekeeper, approached with a disapproving expression. "Mr. Kane," she said coldly, her eyes raking over Margaret's shabby dress and worn shoes. "I see the rumors from town are true." "Mrs. Blackwood," Jackson replied smoothly. "This is my wife, Margaret. She'll need a bath, new clothes, and the master bedroom prepared immediately." Mrs. Blackwood's lips pursed. "Of course, sir, though I should mention that your mother sent word ahead. She'll be arriving within the hour with your father and—" "I don't care," Jackson interrupted. "Do as I asked." As Mrs. Blackwood led Margaret into the mansion, Margaret glanced back at Jackson. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the setting sun, looking like a dark prince surveying his kingdom. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, as the sound of approaching carriages echoed from the road, what was about to happen when Jackson's family arrived? Margaret barely had time to catch her breath before Mrs. Blackwood whisked her up a grand staircase that curved like a swan's neck. The marble steps were so polished that Margaret could see her reflection in the thin, frightened woman in a patched dress who didn't belong here. "This way," Mrs. Blackwood said sharply, her heels clicking against the floor like a clock counting down to disaster. They walked down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced people in expensive clothes. Margaret recognized the cold eyes of Jackson's mother in several of them. Every painted face seemed to judge her as she limped past. "Mrs. Blackwood opened a door at the end of the hall, and Margaret gasped. The bedroom was bigger than the entire house she'd shared with Henry. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the center, draped in deep red velvet. Thick rugs covered the floor. A stone fireplace crackled with fresh flames. Windows overlooked gardens that stretched toward distant hills painted gold by the setting sun. "The bath is through there." Mrs. Blackwood gestured to a side door. "I'll have hot water brought up and find something for you to wear, though I doubt any of the previous Mrs. Kane's dresses will fit properly." "Previous Mrs. Kane?" Margaret asked, confused. Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly, the first hint of humanity Margaret had seen from her. "Mr. Kane's grandmother. She passed 5 years ago. She was a kind woman, not like the rest of them." Before Margaret could ask what that meant, Mrs. Blackwood swept out of the room, leaving Margaret alone in more luxury than she'd ever imagined. Margaret walked slowly to the window, her bad leg aching from the day's stress. Below, she could see Jackson standing in the circular driveway, his arms crossed, waiting for his family to arrive for the battle he'd started. And Margaret was his weapon. A knock at the door made her jump. 3 young maids entered, carrying buckets of steaming water. They didn't meet Margaret's eyes as they filled the bathtub in the adjoining room. When they finished, they curtsied quickly and hurried out, whispering to each other. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation. "Can't believe, Crippled. What was he thinking?" She closed her eyes against the familiar sting of shame. Even here, in her new home, she was still the reject, the damaged goods. But then she remembered Jackson's words. "Anyone who harms you answers to me." Maybe she wasn't completely alone in this. Margaret undressed slowly, wincing as she peeled off the worn stockings that did little to hide her twisted left leg, the leg that had never healed right after the wagon wheel crushed it when she was 15, the leg that had made her father sigh with disappointment, the leg that had made Henry settle for her when prettier girls rejected him, the leg that had made an entire town laugh at her today. But Jackson Kane had looked at that leg and still offered a fortune for her hand. Even if his reasons were selfish, he'd given her something no one else had, a choice that wasn't between bad and worse. The bathwater was hot and smelled like lavender. Margaret sank into it with a groan of relief, feeling muscles she didn't know were tense finally relax. When was the last time she'd had a hot bath? Months, maybe. At the farm, they barely had enough water to drink, let alone waste on bathing. She was scrubbing dirt from under her fingernails when she heard it shouting from downstairs. Loud, angry voices that carried through the mansion's halls like thunder. Jackson's family had arrived. Margaret's hands froze in the water. She should get out, get dressed, face whatever was coming, but fear kept her in the tub, water cooling around her as the voices grew louder. "You did this to spite me." That was Mrs. Kane, Jackson's mother, her voice shrill with fury. "I did this because I'm tired of your control." Jackson's voice was quieter but somehow more dangerous. "She's a cripple, a poor widow. She has nothing. She has me. That's more than enough." A new voice entered the fray deeper, older, with the boom of authority. "Jackson, son, be reasonable. This woman is not suitable to be a Kane. Think of the family name. Think of our reputation." Jackson's father. Margaret pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling sick. She'd known they would hate her, but hearing them discuss her like she was a stain they needed to scrub away cut deeper than she expected. "Our reputation?" Jackson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean the reputation built on lies and stolen land? The reputation of a family that crushed anyone who got in their way? I know exactly what kind of family we are, Father. That's why I'm doing this. You ungrateful, enough." A new voice cut through the chaos. Female, but different from Mrs. Kane. Younger. "Jackson, you can't be serious about this. I'm begging you." Margaret heard genuine pain in that voice. "Hello, Victoria," Jackson said, and for the first time his voice held something almost gentle. "Don't hello Victoria me," the woman said. "You know I've been in love with you since we were children. You know our families have been planning our marriage for years, and you throw it all away for some broken woman you bought at an auction? Why? To hurt me? To hurt all of us?" The silence that followed was heavy. Margaret's chest tightened. Of course, there was a beautiful woman who loved him, a woman from his world, a woman who wasn't broken. "Victoria," Jackson said carefully, "I never promised you anything. Our families made plans. We didn't." "Liar." Victoria's voice cracked. "You said I was beautiful. You danced with me at the summer ball. You smiled at me like I was special. I was kind to you. That's not the same as love." Something shattered glass hitting marble. Victoria screamed in frustration. "I hate you. I hate you, and I hate that crippled witch you brought into this house." "Careful." Jackson's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. "You can hate me all you want, Victoria, but you will not speak about my wife that way." "Your wife?" Victoria laughed hysterically. "You married her already? The auction was this afternoon." "The auction made it legal," Jackson said. "Margaret Colby is now Margaret Kane, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." More shouting, more chaos. Margaret couldn't make out individual words anymore, just a tsunami of anger crashing through the house. She climbed out of the bath, water dripping onto the expensive rugs, and wrapped herself in a towel that was softer than any blanket she'd ever owned. Her hands shook as she tried to dry off. A quiet knock at the door made her freeze. "Mrs. Kane?" A timid voice called. "I have your dress." Margaret wrapped the towel tighter and opened the door a crack. A young maid stood there, barely 16, with red hair and freckles. Unlike the other servants, she smiled shyly. "I'm Annie, ma'am," she said. "Mrs. Blackwood sent me with this." She held up a beautiful green dress that looked like it cost more than Margaret's entire farm had been worth. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Annie slipped into the room and closed the door. "I'll help you dress if that's all right. And ma'am, I just wanted to say, I think what Mr. Kane did was wonderful. My sister has a crooked foot, and nobody ever treated her like she mattered. But Mr. Kane stood up in front of everyone and chose you. That took courage." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. After all the cruelty today, this one small kindness nearly broke her. "Thank you, Annie," she managed. Annie helped her into the dress, which fit surprisingly well. It had long sleeves and a high collar, making Margaret look almost elegant. Almost like she belonged here. Annie styled Margaret's brown hair, pulling it back in a simple but neat style. When Margaret looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She still wasn't beautiful, her face was too thin, her features too plain, but she looked respectable. "There," Annie said proudly. "You look like a proper lady." Another crash from downstairs made them both jump. "It's been like this for an hour," Annie whispered. "The whole family's here now. Mrs. Kane, Mr. Kane Sr., Miss Victoria and her parents, even Mr. Kane's brother Charles rode in from Denver. They're all screaming at him, but he won't back down." Margaret's heart pounded. "What should I do?" "Mr. Kane sent word that you should come down when you're ready," Annie said. "He wants them to meet you properly. Meet them properly. Face the people who hated her. Walk into a room full of wealthy, powerful people who saw her as trash." Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to lock herself in this beautiful room and never come out. But she'd stood on that auction platform today and survived everyone's mockery. Surely she could survive this too. "All right," Margaret said, lifting her chin. "Take me to them." Annie led her back down the grand staircase. The shouting grew louder with each step. Margaret's bad leg nearly gave out twice, but she gripped the banister and forced herself to keep moving. They reached a set of double doors. Through them, Margaret could hear the chaos clearly. "Throwing away everything for a common whore. She probably trapped him somehow. We can have the marriage annulled." Annie pushed open the doors. The enormous parlor fell silent. 8 people stood frozen, all turning to stare at Margaret. Jackson stood near the fireplace, his face expressionless, but his dark eyes alert. Next to him stood an older man who had to be his father, same height, same build, but with gray hair and harder features. Mrs. Kane stood near the window, her face red with fury. A younger man, maybe 30, leaned against the piano. Charles, probably Jackson's brother. He looked amused by the whole situation. And then there was Victoria. She was everything Margaret wasn't. Tall, elegant, with glossy black hair piled in elaborate curls. Her dress was the color of midnight, fitted to show off her perfect figure. Her face was beautiful, classically beautiful, with high cheekbones and full lips. But her eyes, when they landed on Margaret, were pure poison. "So," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "this is the creature you chose over me." "Victoria," Jackson warned, but Victoria ignored him. She glided across the room toward Margaret, her dress swishing with each step. She circled Margaret like a predator examining wounded prey. "Look at you," Victoria murmured, "skinny as a rail, dressed in my grandmother's old clothes. And that leg." She glanced down at Margaret's left foot, where the limp was obvious even standing still. "Does it hurt, or are you just naturally clumsy?" "That's enough," Jackson stepped forward. "No, let her speak," Margaret heard herself say. The words surprised her, but she meant them. She was tired of being silent while people mocked her. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, it speaks. Tell me, Mrs. Kane," she said, the name like a curse. "Did you trap Jackson somehow? Bewitch him? Or did you just spread your legs?" And the slap echoed through the parlor like a gunshot. Margaret's hand stung. Victoria's head had snapped to the side. A red mark bloomed on her perfect cheek. Everyone froze in shock. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She'd never hit anyone in her life, never even raised her voice. But something in Victoria's words had snapped the tight control Margaret had maintained all day. "You?" Victoria touched her cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You hit me. You insulted me," Margaret said, her voice shaking but firm. "You insulted your grandmother by calling her clothes old. And you implied I'm a whore. I may be poor, and I may have a bad leg, but I have dignity. Something you clearly lack despite all your money and beauty." Victoria's face went from shocked to murderous. She lunged at Margaret with a shriek, but Jackson was faster. He caught Victoria around the waist and pulled her back. "Charles, get her out of here." Jackson's brother finally moved, grabbing Victoria by the shoulders. She fought him, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush. "Let me go! I'll kill her! I'll rip that enough!" Jackson's father boomed. His voice was so loud it seemed to shake the walls. Victoria fell silent, still struggling in Charles's grip. Mr. Kane Sr. turned his cold gaze on Margaret. "Young woman, you have entered this house under false pretenses. You have used some trick to ensnare my son, but it won't work. We will have this marriage annulled. We will pay you whatever sum you want to disappear and never speak of this again." He pulled out a checkbook and a pen. Name your price. Margaret stared at the checkbook. She could ask for anything, enough money to start fresh somewhere new, enough to never worry about food or shelter again. All she had to do was walk away from this madness. No, she said quietly. Mr. Kane's pen froze. What did you say? I said no. Margaret's voice grew stronger. I'm not leaving. Jackson chose me, and I chose him. I don't care if you like it or not. Mrs. Kane laughed high and sharp. You fool? You actually think you can survive in our world? You think you can handle the social events, the business dinners, the expectations? You're a crippled farm girl who probably can't even read properly? I can read, Margaret said. Henry taught me, and I can do arithmetic. I can cook and clean and manage a household. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Kane. I'm just poor. There's a difference. Not in our world. There isn't, Mrs. Kane shot back. Then maybe your world needs to change, Margaret said. The silence that followed was absolute. Charles started to laugh. Actually laugh. A deep belly laugh that broke the tension. Oh, I like her. She's got fire. Charles, this isn't funny, his father growled. It's hilarious, Charles said, wiping his eyes. You're all acting like Jackson married a horse instead of a woman. So what if she's poor? So what if she limps? Father, you built this empire from nothing. Grandfather was a dirt farmer. Where do we get off acting like we're royalty? That's different, Mrs. Kane insisted. We earned our place. She's just enough. Jackson's voice cut through the room like a blade. All of you, get out. We're not done discussing this, his father said. Yes, we are. Jackson's eyes were hard as flint. This is my house, my ranch, my life, and Margaret is my wife. You can accept it or you can leave. Those are your only options. Mr. Kane's face turned purple. You ungrateful if you do this. If you keep this woman, we will cut you off. No more family funds. No more support. You'll be on your own. Jackson smiled coldly. Father, I bought this ranch with money I earned myself. I built it into the largest cattle operation in the territory without your help. I don't need your funds. I never have. What about the political connections? Mrs. Kane demanded. The social standing? You'll be an outcast. Good, Jackson said simply. Mrs. Kane looked like she might faint. Mr. Kane grabbed her arm to steady her. We're leaving, Mr. Kane announced. But this isn't over. Mark my words, boy. This marriage will destroy you. He stormed toward the door, dragging Mrs. Kane with him. Charles released Victoria, who shot Margaret a look of pure hatred before following them out. Charles paused at the door. For what it's worth, brother, he said quietly, I hope this works out. God knows this family could use some shaking up. Then he was gone too. The door slammed. The house fell silent except for the crackling fire. Margaret's legs finally gave out. She sank onto the nearest chair, her whole body trembling. Jackson poured 2 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter and handed one to Margaret. Drink. She took a sip and coughed as the liquid burned down her throat. You did well, Jackson said, surprising her. I hit someone, Margaret whispered. I've never hit anyone in my life. Victoria had it coming. Jackson sat in the chair across from her. She's been spoiled her whole life. No one's ever told her no before. They sat in silence for a moment. The events of the day crashed over Margaret like waves. This morning she'd been a desperate widow facing an auction. Now she was married to the richest man in the territory and had just slapped his family's chosen bride. How was any of this real? Why? Margaret asked suddenly. Why go through all this? Is revenge really worth it? Jackson studied his brandy glass. My family has controlled every aspect of my life since I was born. Who I talked to, where I went, what I studied. They tried to choose my friends, my career, my wife, everything. He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. When I saw you on that platform today, being rejected and mocked, I saw myself. Different circumstances, but the same thing, people treating you like your worth was determined by things you can't control. Your leg, my family name. So, you married me to prove a point? Margaret asked. I married you to take back control of my life, Jackson corrected. And yes, to prove a point, but also because he hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. You stood up there and took all that cruelty without breaking. You refused Griggs even though you had nothing. That takes strength. Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. It wasn't love, they barely knew each other. But it was the first time anyone had acknowledged her strength instead of her weakness. What happens now? She asked. Now, you become Mrs. Jackson Kane. He stood and offered his hand. Starting with dinner. The The staff has prepared a meal." Margaret took his hand and stood, her leg protesting. Jackson noticed her wince. "Does it hurt?" he asked, and unlike Victoria's cruel question, his seemed genuinely concerned. "Sometimes," Margaret admitted, "especially when I'm tired or stressed. We have a doctor who visits the ranch. I'll have him examine it tomorrow." They walked to the dining room, Jackson matching his pace to hers without making it obvious. The dining table was enormous, set with more silverware than Margaret had ever seen. She had no idea which fork to use or where to sit. Jackson pulled out a chair for her at the head of the table. "You sit here." "But isn't that your seat?" "You're the lady of the house," Jackson said simply. "This is your seat now." As servants brought out course after course of delicious food, Margaret's head spun with everything that had happened. The auction, the rejection, Jackson's bid, the confrontation with his family, Victoria's slap, and somehow, through it all, she'd survived. She was sitting in a mansion, wearing a beautiful dress, about to eat food she'd never dreamed of tasting. She was Margaret Kane, now wife of the most powerful man in the territory. But as she looked across the table at Jackson's unreadable face, she wondered what price she would ultimately pay for this new life. The door burst open, making Margaret drop her fork. Mrs. Blackwood stood there, her face white as a sheet. "Mr. Kane, sir, there's a problem." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "What kind of problem?" "Your cattle, sir. Someone's opened the south pasture gates. 2,000 head are loose and heading for the canyon. If they go over the edge..." Jackson was on his feet before she finished speaking. "Get every available man on horseback, now." He turned to Margaret. "I have to go. This could be disaster if we don't stop them." "I'll come with you," Margaret said, standing. "You can't ride with that leg." "I can ride," Margaret interrupted. "Henry taught me. I'm not useless, Jackson." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or surprise. "All right," he said, "but you stay back from the herd." "Understood?" Margaret nodded. Within minutes, they were racing through the darkness on horseback, Jackson on a massive black stallion, Margaret on a gentler mare. Behind them, 20 ranch hands thundered through the night. The chaos of the cattle drive helped Margaret forget everything else. The danger, the shouting, the dust and sweat and fear. She forgot she was the reject bride. She forgot she was the woman nobody wanted. She was just Margaret, riding hard through the night, trying to save 2,000 cattle from plunging to their deaths. And when they finally turned the herd, when the last cow was safely back in the pasture and the gates were secured, Jackson rode up beside her. "You did good," he said, breathing hard. Margaret smiled a real smile, maybe the first one all day. But as they rode back toward the mansion, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. The south pasture gate hadn't just been opened by accident. Someone had deliberately cut the lock. Someone wanted Jackson's cattle to die. Someone wanted to hurt him. And Margaret had a terrible feeling she knew who. "Jackson," she said quietly, "we need to talk about your family." The sun hadn't yet risen when Margaret woke to find Jackson's side of the bed empty. They'd shared the room last night, though. Jackson had been a perfect gentleman, sleeping on top of the covers while Margaret took the bed properly. After the cattle incident, they'd both been too exhausted to discuss sleeping arrangements. Margaret sat up, her leg aching from the hard riding. Through the window, she could see Jackson in the distance, inspecting the damaged fence with several ranch hands. Even from here, she could see the tension in his shoulders. Someone had sabotaged his ranch, and they both suspected it was his family. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Annie entered with a breakfast tray. "Morning, Mrs. Kane," Annie said cheerfully. "Mr. Kane said you should eat and rest. He'll be back this afternoon." "I can't just sit here while there's work to be done," Margaret protested. Annie's eyes widened. "Ma'am, ladies don't work the ranch. That's not proper." "Proper?" Margaret almost laughed. "Annie, I'm a farm girl married to spite his family. Nothing about this situation is proper." She dressed quickly in the simplest dress she could find and made her way downstairs, ignoring the stares of servants who clearly thought she should stay in her room like a proper lady. Mrs. Blackwood intercepted her in the main hall. "Mrs. Kane, where are you going?" "To see what needs doing," Margaret said firmly. "This is my home now. I should know how it works." Mrs. Blackwood's stern expression cracked slightly. "You're nothing like the women who usually visit this house." Is that a compliment or an insult? For the first time, Mrs. Blackwood smiled just a little. Come with me. I'll show you the household accounts. If you're going to be lady of this house, you might as well learn how it runs. For the next several hours, Mrs. Blackwood walked Margaret through the massive operation of running the Kane household. There were 30 servants, from stable boys to cooks to maids. The weekly food budget alone was more than Margaret had spent on food in a year at the farm. The previous Mrs. Mr. Jackson's grandmother, she managed everything herself, Mrs. Blackwood explained. She was a rancher's daughter before she married into the family, knew how to work, not just spend money. What happened to her? Margaret asked. Mrs. Blackwood's face softened with genuine sadness. She got sick 5 years ago, pneumonia. Mr. Jackson was devastated. She was the only person in his family who truly loved him, not what he could do for them. That explained a lot, Margaret thought. Why Jackson was so cold, why he trusted no one. After she died, Mrs. Blackwood continued, the family tried to control everything, especially his mother. She wanted Jackson to marry Victoria and move back to the main family estate in Dallas, give up the ranch, become a proper society gentleman. But he refused, Margaret guessed. He did more than refuse. He bought out his father's share of this ranch with his own money, made it clear he'd never live by their rules. Mrs. Blackwood looked at Margaret carefully. That's why they hate you so much. You're proof that Jackson will never come back to them. A commotion outside made them both turn to the window. 3 carriages were rolling up the drive, dusty from hard travel. Margaret's stomach sank. More family? Worse, Mrs. Blackwood muttered. That's the social committee from town. The ladies who decide who's acceptable in polite society. Before Margaret could ask what that meant, the front door burst open. 5 women in elaborate dresses swept in like a perfumed storm. Leading them was a woman with iron gray hair and a nose like a hawk's beak. Where is she? The woman demanded. Where is this woman who's caused such scandal? Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward. Mrs. Pemberton, if you'll wait in the parlor, I will not wait. Mrs. Pemberton spotted Margaret and descended on her like a bird of prey. So, you're the crippled widow who trapped Jackson Kane. Margaret lifted her chin. After facing Victoria and Mrs. Kane, this woman didn't scare her. I'm Margaret Kane, and I didn't trap anyone. Of course you did. Mrs. Pemberton circled her, examining every detail of Margaret's simple dress and plain appearance. A man like Jackson Kane would never willingly marry someone like you unless you used feminine wiles or trickery. Someone like me? Margaret's voice went cold. You mean poor? Or do you mean crippled? The other women gasped at Margaret's bluntness. I mean unsuitable, Mrs. Pemberton said icily. You don't belong in our society, Mrs. Kane. You weren't born into it. You don't understand our ways, and frankly, you're an embarrassment to every respectable woman in the territory. Something inside Margaret snapped. She'd spent her whole life being told she wasn't good enough, being judged for things she couldn't control, and she was done accepting it. You're right, Margaret said quietly. I'm not like you. I've worked for everything I have. I've gone hungry. I've had dirt under my fingernails and calluses on my hands. I've been rejected and mocked and told I'm worthless. She stepped closer to Mrs. Pemberton, who actually backed up a step. But I survived, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. I survived being poor and disabled and widowed. I survived an auction where an entire town laughed at me. And I'll survive you too, Mrs. Pemberton. Because unlike you, I don't need anyone's approval to know my worth. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Pemberton's face turned red, then purple. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you know who I am? A bully, Margaret said simply. A woman who uses her position to hurt people weaker than her. Just like the cowboys who laughed at me yesterday. Just like Jackson's family who think money makes them better than everyone else. I will ruin you, Mrs. Pemberton hissed. You'll never be accepted in this territory. Every door will close to you. Every woman will turn her back when you pass. Good, Margaret said, echoing Jackson's word from yesterday. I'd rather be alone than accepted by people who measure worth by bank accounts and bloodlines. Mrs. Pemberton looked like she might explode. She spun toward her companions. Ladies, we're leaving. This woman is impossible. But one of the other women younger, with kind eyes, stepped forward. Wait, Mrs. Pemberton. I'd like to stay and talk to Mrs. Kane. Absolutely not. If you stay, Rebecca, you'll be just as ostracized as she is. Rebecca smiled. Then I guess I'll be ostracized." Mrs. Pemberton gasped in outrage, then stormed out with the other 3 women trailing behind her. Their carriage wheels kicked up dust as they raced away. Rebecca laughed a bright, genuine sound. "I've wanted to do that for years. Mrs. Pemberton has bullied everyone in this territory for too long." "You didn't have to defend me," Margaret said, surprised. "Are you kidding?" "You just said everything I've been thinking." Rebecca held out her hand. "I'm Rebecca Morrison. My husband owns the lumber mill in town, and I think you're exactly what this territory needs, someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth." For the first time since arriving at the Kane Ranch, Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest. Maybe she wasn't completely alone after all. They sat in the parlor, and Rebecca explained the complex social hierarchy of the territory. Mrs. Pemberton controlled most of it through intimidation and gossip. Anyone who crossed her found themselves excluded from parties, business opportunities, and social events. "But here's the thing," Rebecca said, her eyes twinkling. "You're Mrs. Jackson Kane. That makes you more powerful than Mrs. Pemberton, whether she likes it or not. The Kane name opens doors that nothing else can." "Jackson married me despite his family," Margaret admitted. "I'm not sure how much power that really gives me." "Maybe that's how it started," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "But I saw you both at the cattle drive last night. My husband was one of the ranch hands helping. He said Jackson looked at you differently than he's looked at any woman before." Margaret's heart fluttered, but she pushed the feeling down. "We barely know each other. Sometimes that's when the real things start," Rebecca said with a knowing smile. A ranch hand burst into the parlor, his face panicked. "Mrs. Kane, there's been an accident at the north pasture. Mr. Kane's been hurt." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "How badly?" "Don't know, ma'am. They're bringing him back now." Margaret actually ran despite her bad leg to the front of the house. Rebecca followed close behind. They arrived just as 4 men carried Jackson through the door on a makeshift stretcher. Blood soaked through his shirt. His face was pale, his eyes closed. "What happened?" Margaret demanded, her voice shaking. "The fence gave way while he was inspecting it, ma'am," one of the ranch hands said. "He fell into the ravine. Cut himself bad on the rocks. Get Dr. Harrison," Mrs. Blackwood ordered, "and bring him to the master bedroom. Quickly!" They carried Jackson upstairs. Margaret followed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. This couldn't be happening, not now. Not when she was just starting to understand him. They laid Jackson on the bed, the same bed Margaret had slept in last night. His shirt was torn open, revealing a deep gash across his ribs. It wasn't fatal, but it was bad. "The fence didn't just give way," Jackson muttered, his eyes fluttering open. "It was cut, same as the gate." "Don't talk," Margaret said, grabbing a clean cloth and pressing it against the wound to stop the bleeding. "Save your strength." Jackson's hand caught hers, surprisingly strong despite his injuries. "My family did this. They're trying to force me to give you up, to show me I can't protect you and the ranch. Then we'll protect it together," Margaret said firmly. Dr. Harrison arrived 30 minutes later, a gray-haired man with steady hands. He stitched Jackson's wound while Margaret held his hand, feeling him grip tighter each time the needle pierced his skin. "You'll live," Dr. Harrison said when he finished. "But you need rest, at least a week in bed." "I don't have a week," Jackson protested. "Someone's sabotaging my ranch." "Then let your wife handle it," Dr. Harrison said, surprising them both. "She seems capable enough." After the doctor left, Jackson looked at Margaret seriously. "You can't manage a ranch. You don't know how." "I managed a farm for 2 years after Henry got sick," Margaret countered. "I know more than you think. This is different. There are business dealings, contracts with buyers, payroll." "Then teach me," Margaret interrupted. "Or better yet, trust me to figure it out." Jackson studied her for a long moment. "Why? Why do you care about this ranch? About me? You could take the easy path, stay quiet, let my family win, and probably get a nice settlement when they force the marriage annulled." Margaret thought about that. Why did she care? Jackson had married her for revenge, not love. He'd used her as a weapon against his family. But somewhere between the auction and now, something had changed. She'd seen glimpses of the real Jackson, the man who slowed his pace for her limp, who defended her against Victoria, who fought for his independence against overwhelming family pressure. "Because," Margaret said carefully, "you gave me a choice when no one else would. You made me feel like I mattered, even if your reasons were selfish. And maybe I want to prove I'm more than just the reject bride everyone thinks I am." Jackson's dark eyes softened, really softened, for the first time since she'd met him. You already have. The moment hung between them, fragile and real. Then Annie burst into the room, her face white with terror. "Miss Kane, come quick, there's a fire." Margaret ran to the window. Smoke billowed from one of the barns, the one where they stored the winter hay. Flames licked at the wooden walls, spreading fast. "No!" Jackson tried to get up, then collapsed back with a groan as his stitches pulled. "Stay here," Margaret ordered. She turned to Annie. "Get every available person with water buckets. Now!" Margaret raced downstairs and out into the yard, her bad leg screaming in protest. Ranch hands were already forming bucket lines from the well to the barn, but it wasn't enough. The fire was spreading too fast. "The horses!" someone yelled. "There are horses still inside." Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a wet blanket and ran toward the burning barn. Behind her, she heard Rebecca screaming her name, telling her to stop. But Margaret didn't stop. Inside the barn, smoke choked the air. 3 horses whinnied in terror, trapped in their stalls by flames blocking the exit. Margaret's eyes watered, but she could see well enough. She threw the wet blanket over her head and shoulders, then ran to the first stall. The horse inside reared in panic. "Easy, easy," Margaret murmured, fumbling with the latch. Her hands shook, but she got it open. The horse bolted past her toward the door. 2 more to go. The smoke was getting thicker. Margaret's lungs burned. Her leg buckled and she fell to her knees, but she crawled to the second stall. The latch was jammed. Margaret pulled with all her strength, feeling something tear in her shoulder. The latch gave way. The second horse ran free. 1 more, but the flames had spread to block the path to the third stall. Through the smoke and fire, Margaret could see the horse thrashing in terror. She'd never make it, but she had to try. Margaret wrapped the wet blanket tighter and pushed. Through the flames, heat seared her skin. The blanket started to smoke, but she reached the stall and threw open the door. The horse charged out, nearly trampling her in its panic. Margaret tried to follow, but her leg gave out completely. She fell hard, hitting her head on a support beam. The world spun. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. She was going to die here. Then strong arms grabbed her, lifting her like she weighed nothing. Through the haze, Margaret saw Charles Jackson's brother, his face set in grim determination as he carried her out of the burning barn. They burst into fresh air just as part of the barn collapsed behind them. Margaret coughed and gasped, her lungs desperate for clean air. Charles laid her on the ground gently. "You're insane," he said, but he was smiling. "Brave, but insane." "The horses," Margaret managed between coughs. "Are they safe?" "All safe, thanks to you." Charles helped her sit up. "My brother chose better than I thought." The ranch hands finally got the fire under control, though the barn was a total loss. Margaret sat on the ground, covered in soot and ash, her dress ruined, her leg throbbing, her lungs raw. But she'd saved the horses. Mrs. Blackwood appeared with a blanket and wrapped it around Margaret's shoulders. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. I haven't decided which. Can I be both?" Margaret asked weakly. Mrs. Blackwood actually laughed, a real laugh that transformed her stern face. "Yes, Mrs. Kane, I think you can." They helped Margaret back to the house. Jackson was already trying to get out of bed when she entered the bedroom. "Don't you dare," Margaret warned, pointing a soot-covered finger at him. "Doctor," Harrison said, "bed rest." "You ran into a burning building." Jackson's face was torn between anger and something else, fear, maybe. "You could have died, but I didn't." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "The horses are safe. That's what matters." Jackson stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You're covered in soot. Your dress is burned. You're limping worse than ever. And you're smiling." Margaret realized he was right. She was smiling. Despite everything, despite the pain and fear and chaos, she felt alive. More alive than she'd felt in years. "I helped," she said simply. "I wasn't useless or broken or rejected. I helped save something important." Jackson reached out and gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek. The gesture was so tender it made Margaret's breath catch. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. "I bought you to spite my family, but somewhere along the way, you became the best thing that's ever happened to me." Margaret's heart soared. "Jackson, someone set that fire," Charles interrupted from the doorway. "I found an oil can near the barn." This wasn't an accident. The moment shattered. Jackson's face hardened. My family. We don't know that for certain, Charles said, but his expression suggested otherwise. Who else? Jackson demanded. Who else wants to destroy my ranch and drive Margaret away? Margaret's mind raced. The cut gate, the damaged fence, the fire. Someone was escalating, getting more dangerous, more desperate. We need proof, she said. If we accuse them without proof, they'll just deny it and make us look paranoid. She's right, Charles agreed. But how do we get proof? An idea formed in Margaret's mind, dangerous, but it might work. We set a trap. Both men looked at her. Tomorrow night, we announce we're hosting a dinner, Margaret explained. We invite your family, Mrs. Pemberton, Victoria, everyone who hates this marriage. We make it seem like we're trying to make peace. And then? Jackson asked. And then we watch to see who tries to sabotage us again. But this time, we'll be ready. It was risky. It could go wrong in 100 ways, but it was the only plan they had. Jackson looked at Charles. Can you help us? Charles grinned the same dangerous grin Jackson sometimes wore. I thought you'd never ask. I've wanted to take Mother down a peg for years. They spent the rest of the day planning. Margaret barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The next morning, formal invitations went out to the entire Kane family, plus Victoria and her parents, plus Mrs. Pemberton and the social committee. Almost everyone accepted. They were coming to see Margaret fail, to watch her fumble through a formal dinner and prove she didn't belong in their world. But Margaret had other plans. She worked with Mrs. Blackwood and the staff to prepare a dinner that would outshine anything the Kane family had ever hosted. She practiced walking without her limp showing too, badly. She let Annie style her hair in an elaborate updo. She wore the most beautiful dress in the late Mrs. Kane's collection, a deep emerald gown that made her pale skin glow. When she looked in the mirror, Margaret barely recognized herself. You look like a queen, Annie breathed. That's exactly what Margaret wanted. The guests arrived at sunset. Margaret stood at the top of the grand staircase, Jackson beside her in his finest suit despite his injuries. Together, they descended to greet their guests. Mrs. Kane's face went white when she saw Margaret. Victoria looked like she might be sick. Mrs. Pemberton's jaw actually dropped. Welcome to our home, Margaret said graciously, her voice carrying across the entrance hall. Thank you for joining us tonight. The dinner was a triumph. Every course was perfect. Every wine was paired correctly. Margaret engaged the guests in conversation, surprising them with her intelligence and wit. She discussed cattle prices with the men and household management with the women. She never stumbled, never faltered. She was everything a society wife should be and more. But all the while, Charles and several trusted ranch hands were positioned around the property, watching for any suspicious activity. Halfway through dessert, one of the ranch hands burst into the dining room. Mr. Kane, someone's trying to poison the well. Everyone at the table froze. Jackson stood slowly, his eyes scanning the guests. How interesting. We're all here at dinner, so who could possibly be poisoning my well? Mrs. Kane's face went pale. Jackson, you can't possibly think I don't think, Mother. I know. Jackson nodded to Charles, who left the room. He returned minutes later, dragging someone by the arm, a ranch hand Margaret didn't recognize. Tell them, Charles ordered. The man's face was sweaty with fear. I was just following orders. Mr. Kane Sr. paid me to sabotage the ranch, the gate, the fence, the fire, all of it. He said if I could make things bad enough, Mr. Jackson would have to give up the crippled girl and come back to Dallas. The room erupted in chaos. Mr. Kane Sr. shot to his feet. That's a lie. This man is clearly deranged. I have the bank records, Charles said, pulling papers from his jacket. Payments from your account to his. Dates matching every incident. You're done, Father. Mrs. Kane began to cry. Victoria looked shocked. Mrs. Pemberton and the other guests whispered frantically among themselves. Margaret felt surprisingly calm. She'd expected this. Hoped for it, even. Now everyone would know the truth. Jackson walked slowly around the table until he stood before his father. You tried to destroy my ranch. You put my wife's life in danger. You hired someone to poison my water supply, all because you couldn't control me. She's made you weak, Mr. Kane Sr. shouted. That crippled nobody has poisoned your mind against your own family. No, Jackson said quietly. She opened my eyes. She showed me what real strength looks like, what real courage is. You're the weak one, Father. You always have been. He turned to the guests. Everyone knows the truth now. My father tried to destroy my life because I wouldn't obey him, and my mother helped him. I did no such thing," Mrs. Kane protested. "You knew," Margaret said, speaking for the first time since the revelation. "You might not have hired the man yourself, but you knew what your husband was doing, and you said nothing." Mrs. Kane's silence was answer enough. Jackson addressed the room. "You all came here expecting to see me fail, expecting my marriage to fall apart, expecting Margaret to prove she doesn't belong in your world." He walked to Margaret and took her hand. "But she's already proven something far more important. She's proven that worth isn't measured by money or bloodlines or whether you can walk without a limp. It's measured by courage, by kindness, by strength of character." Jackson turned to his father. "You're no longer welcome on my property. None of you are not, unless you can accept Margaret as my wife and treat her with the respect she deserves. You'll regret this," Mr. Kane Sr. hissed. "Without family support, you'll fail. I have all the support I need," Jackson said, squeezing Margaret's hand. The Kane family stormed out, along with Victoria and her parents. But Mrs. Pemberton and several of the other guests remained. Mrs. Pemberton stood slowly. Margaret braced herself for another attack. But instead, Mrs. Pemberton curtsied to Margaret. "Mrs. Kane," she said formally, "I apologize for my earlier rudeness. You have proven yourself a woman of remarkable strength and grace. I would be honored if you would consider joining our social committee." Margaret stared in shock. What? "We need women like you," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Women who aren't afraid to speak truth, who aren't impressed by wealth alone. Will you join us?" Margaret looked at Jackson, who nodded with a small smile. "I will," Margaret said, "on one condition: we help women like I used to be. Widows, poor women, women who need support, not judgment." Mrs. Pemberton considered this, then smiled her first genuine smile. "Agreed." The remaining guests left in a much friendlier mood than they'd arrived. Soon, only Jackson, Margaret, Charles, and Rebecca remained. "Well," Charles said, pouring himself a brandy, "that was the most entertaining dinner I've attended in years." "Thank you for helping us," Margaret said sincerely. "Thank you for giving me ammunition against Father," Charles replied with a grin. "He's controlled this family too long. It's time for a change." After Charles and Rebecca left, Margaret and Jackson stood alone in the grand dining room. The candles had burned low. The servants had cleared most of the dishes. "It's over," Margaret said softly. "No," Jackson corrected. "It's just beginning." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Margaret, when I bought you at that auction, I thought I was using you. I thought this was about revenge and control. And now?" Margaret's heart pounded. "Now I realize I'm the one who was saved that day. You walked into my life and turned everything upside down. You challenged me. You showed me what real strength looks like. You risked your life to save my horses. You stood up to my family, to Mrs. Pemberton, to everyone who said you weren't good enough." Jackson's voice grew thick with emotion. "You are more than good enough, Margaret. You're extraordinary. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a weapon and started seeing you as everything." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "I'm still a poor widow with a bad leg. You're also brave, intelligent, kind, and the strongest person I've ever met." Jackson wiped her tears gently. "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Kane. If you'll have me not as a business arrangement, but as a real marriage." Margaret thought about the girl who'd stood on that auction platform just days ago. Broken, rejected, hopeless. She thought about everything that had happened since. The battles fought, the courage found, the life reclaimed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you, because I'm falling in love with you too." Jackson kissed her, then not a gentle kiss, but one full of passion and promise and everything they'd been holding back. Margaret kissed him back, pouring all her fear and hope and love into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jackson smiled a real smile that transformed his whole face. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked. "I'm thinking the whole territory is going to talk about this for years. The cattle baron who married the reject bride and made her his queen." Margaret laughed. "Let them talk. We know the truth. And what's that? That sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. That courage matters more than circumstances. And that real love doesn't care about limp legs or damaged reputations or family expectations." Jackson pulled her close. "The queen of my empire. "And you're the king of mine," Margaret replied. Outside, the moon rose over the Kane Ranch, thousands of acres of land that Margaret could now call home. A home she'd fought for, a home she'd earned. She was no longer the reject bride. She was Margaret Kane, wife, partner, and queen of an empire built not on money or revenge, but on something far more valuable: love born from the ashes of rejection. And that, Margaret knew, was the greatest triumph of all. The end.